We're glad to have Dr. Eric Hayot with us. Dr. Eric Hayot is a distinguished professor of comparative literature and Asian studies and the director of the Center for Humanities and Information at Pennsylvania State University. He's the author of numerous books, including Chinese Dreams, Hypothetical Mandarin, on literary words, and a hugely influential book called The Elements of Academic Style, Writing for the Humanities. And more recently, he has translated Peter Janik's What is Information from German to English. And just a few months ago, another great book published by Columbia University Press called A Humanist Reason, A History, an Argument, and a Plan. And that's the book we're discussing today. Eric, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Murtaza, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. So let's start with the title of the book. When I first came across the book, I thought it was Humanist Reason, reason as it's opposed to passion. But just a few pages into the book and the very interesting anecdote that you start the book with made me understand that this is reason such as scientific reason, just like we have scientific reason or scientific method. And when I was reading that anecdote, it was like a deja vu moment because I also had a few colleagues who were hardcore scientists and also some friends who were very much against humanities. And whenever I was trying to have a meaningful argument or conversation with them, I felt I'm banging my head against a brick wall. And I guess this issue is more emblematic of a problem in universities where the knowledge that is produced from by STEM or scientists is considered to be proper knowledge, whereas anything that doesn't go through those mathematical calculations are usually relegated as opinion. So I was wondering if you could start with the anecdote that you start the book with.
Sure. I mean, the anecdote that I begin the book with is involves a scene in that happened around, I think, sometime in 2007 or so or 8. And I was sitting at a talk by an economist who teaches at UCLA, and I was at UCLA. He was at the time at Stanford, in which he was proving, thanks to a kind of relatively complicated mathematical analysis of technological, of economic development as compared to genetic drift among populations, attempting to prove the following proposition, which is that the development of technology is not simply dependent on proximity to the developers, but also dependent on cultural relationships between neighbors. So to give you an example, according to a certain kind of view, an economic rational actor view, it would make sense if I live here and someone lives next door and someone else lives on the other side exactly the same distance, and I invent something new, that two people on the other side of me, equidistant from me, would adopt that technology at the same time relative to me. That is, I do it first, and then, I don't know, a week later, a year later, but in any case, at roughly the same time, these two neighbors who are equidistant adopt it, and someone who's much farther away will then adopt it even more slowly, and so on. That's obviously not how things happen in the real world, and the speaker that I was listening to was attempting to prove this. Now, if you ask, well, why? If you think why to yourself, why? Imagine that again, I invent something and I have a neighbor here and a neighbor here. Why might it not happen that our neighbors access this technology at the same speed? You might say, well, maybe I'm friends with this neighbor and I don't like this neighbor, right? Or maybe I'm Catholic and this neighbor is Catholic, but this other neighbor is Protestant or an atheist. Or you might say, this neighbor and I have been allied in a fight against our other neighbor over there, and this neighbor hasn't, or I'm black and this neighbor's black and this other neighbor is not black, and so on and so forth. We can think of all kinds of reasons why forms of culture might distort what you might think of as a kind of purely rational and again, I hesitate to use the word natural because you can imagine that there's a natural progress. My claim would be that there has never been a natural progress of technology, that technology, in fact, is highly mediated by these kinds of relationships. I think your viewers in Iran, which is the subject of a great deal of technological control from parts of the world that are not friends with Iran. Again, I make no claims about the goodness or badness of that, but understand very clearly and have lived very clearly the ways in which, in fact, the flow of technological innovation is not a simple matter of getting from one place to the other. This is something not only that I know, but I think anyone who thinks about it very hard knows. And it's something that's been described in my field, in the fields of history and science and technology studies and literary studies, for hundreds of years, if not longer. And yet I was watching a man who was clearly a very accomplished economist present this information that, in fact, this rationalist model of technological diffusion was wrong, and that, in fact, technological diffusion is affected by culture and other forms, as though this were significant new scientific research. Mm-hmm. And that was what was so strange to me, was that for this man, he had been able to move through the world and to come to a position where he was doing what he thought was important research, and other people at Stanford University thought was important research, and my colleagues at UCLA who had invited him to give the talk thought was important research, without having ever to recognize that the very question he was asking had already been answered via another set of methods, non-mathematical, non-genetic, non-quantitative methods, perfectly well, perfectly clearly, with great deal of detail and complexity and so on and so forth. And so this was a moment when I realized that for this guy, humanist knowledge, which is what I would describe, if you said to me, do you know that the diffusion of technology does not happen in a purely distance-mediated way, but has other forms of cultural mediation, I would say, yes, I know that. I know it. That is, I know it in the same way that I know that 2 + 2 makes 4, or that, the COVID-19 vaccinations work, or whatever. That is, I know this fact in the same way that I know a scientific or mathematical fact. But for this guy who was giving this talk, who otherwise is, again, a perfectly pleasant person, that knowledge wasn't real knowledge. That information wasn't real information. What I and a million other humanists had believed, and in fact, what lots of ordinary people know based on reading the newspaper or living their lives, was simply not real knowledge. And it wasn't going to be real knowledge until he managed to kind of push it through the economics machine in some respects. So the problem then that I'm trying to address in the book, and the reason I begin the book with that anecdote, is because this seems to me to be the fundamental problem of the humanities, or one of the fundamental problems of the humanities today, which is that many, many people, not just economists, but many people in government, many people in STEM fields, many people who are in charge of the education system, and many people in their ordinary lives simply do not think that humanist knowledge is real knowledge. They think only mathematical and scientific knowledge is real knowledge. And as you said earlier, that humanist knowledge is merely opinion. That is, it's just someone kind of, it's the same kind of opinion that you might have when you say, I like rock music, or I like vanilla ice cream, or whatever, which is to say, it's just a kind of set of preferences that you make up like this, that has no status. And no status, not only no status intellectually, but no status in terms of its capacity to organize the way we run society, for example, or organize the way we teach, or set up courses, or subsidize the university study of certain fields, and so on and so forth. So that's, in some sense, that's the problem with which the book begins, the fundamental problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. And I guess it was a classic example in the book. You mentioned that when you raised your objection, you were called a Leninist, and I guess it's a classical example of when knowledge is weaponized, especially when people from STEM fields or humanities get into a discussion about these issues. And I realize it has even become more heightened with a very close friend of mine who studied evolutionary psychology, and we see things completely differently when it comes to the ideas of race or justice or inequality. So it seems that in some fields it could, we'll get to that later on, in attempts to scientize literature anyway. In some fields they do try to come up with these formulas or statistical models to find a justification, not justification, explanation, which is usually said that it's natural order of things.
Right.
Yeah. And you've also mentioned, I listened to one of the interviews earlier, and you did mention this, that because science is great at many things, at solving many problems, it doesn't mean that it can solve a lot of problems, or all the problems, let's say. And you do have some issues with scientific method. And in the book, you mentioned that it's a model that studies an inanimate object, or parts of an animate object, or a non-conscious entity, and then it's generalized or applied to the whole society as a whole, whereas there are areas where it's only where a humanist method, or let's say a humanistic knowledge, can also address the problems.
Yes. So let's think back to this example of culture. If I were asking, if I spill a liquid in a certain place, what affects the flow of that liquid in other directions? And, plainly, I can describe liquid in particular is complex mathematics, but you can use mathematics to describe and predict exactly how that liquid will flow across surfaces. You can look at the slope and the angle, the viscosity of the liquid, and so on. You can predict the speed. And indeed, it's quite reasonable to assume that given two things that are equally distant from the liquid with equal slopes and so on, in fact, the liquid will reach them at the same time. We all understand how that works. So when you think about what that economist is doing, what he's doing is he's starting with an idea of what is a natural situation. And for him, the question is, how do I explain the ways that humans distort the natural situation? That is, and again, you can imagine this is, a perfectly reasonable question, but the fundamental place he begins is with that idea of a natural situation. My claim would be that in the humanities, we do not begin with the assumption that the natural situation is one in which all things are equal and mathematically describable. We begin with a much more complex and rich theory of what the natural situation of human beings is. The natural situation of human beings is, as we know, a situation in which beings with minds, complex and rich minds, interact symbolically, are moved by all kinds of factors, some of which are nakedly biological, like hunger and the need to sleep, and so on, some of which are a combination of biology and psychology, like the need to dominate or the need to feel safe, some of which are purely at some level, or maybe more psychological than others, a kind of preference for certain kinds of, falling in love with certain kinds of people, or a preference for, or a preference to be in certain kinds of spaces as the result of some psychological trauma that one suffered. A tendency to organize into tribes or groups is clearly very basic to some kind of sense of humanity, and so on and so forth. So that part of what I would say is that, what happens when a certain kind of a set of scientific methods begins to orient itself towards social life is that it first of all begins with this fundamentally distorted assumption that there is a natural or rational way that things ought to proceed, which would be ideally describable. And then what happens is that humans somehow invalidate or screw that up in some way. And my claim would be that, in fact, if you want to study human life, if you want to study liquids, that's a great method. That is, if you want to study liquids, go for it. Or if you want to study the rotation of planets and so on and so forth, that's a great method. Or how to, or how to insert an mRNA virus into the body, right? Though again, that's an interesting place, because if the question is, how do I best insert a vaccine into a human body? There's two answers to that. One of them is use a needle. That's a good scientific answer. The other question is, how do you get someone to agree to hold still so that you can vaccinate them? Right? Or how do you get someone to agree to come in and get the vaccination? Or in fact, how do you get someone to agree to distribute vaccine supplies around the world such that people have the opportunity to be vaccinated? These are not questions that are susceptible to the scientific method in the same way. Clearly, because if they were, we would be done, right? Everyone would be vaccinated against COVID, it would be fine, right? So we see there with COVID that, in fact, science is great for, or a certain kind of raw scientific method is great for dealing with inanimate objects. But the minute you are dealing with beings with minds, you need to supplement that scientific work, or to begin, maybe not even supplement, because that implies that the scientific work is somehow primary. You need to begin with a very different set of assumptions. And in the experimental model that science uses is not really able to be used in the same way, which is why most of our knowledge in the humanities is produced by historical and cultural and sociological analysis, not by experimental analysis, right? And that makes things hard. That makes things complicated. As we know, if it were easy, right? If it were easy, then we would all be happy, right? Everyone would be happy all the time. We would figure it out. But it's not easy. Right? It's clearly not easy. And the reason it's not easy, I think, has to do with the complexity of the beings involved, that is, of the research material, of the objects that we're engaged with, which are these incredibly rich complicated objects called human beings. And again, human beings operating in symbolic and social situations, meaning that it's not just a question of understanding what one person does, but there is no such thing in our research field as a single person. There are only groups of people, single people within the framework of groups of people, right? And those groups in the framework of other groups. And all of those groups and all of those individuals are then using symbols of various kinds, visual symbols. The most obvious one is language, but facial gestures and so on and so forth, in order to interact. And that the minimum level of complexity for any humanist research is then a human being in a group using symbols. Right? That's where we have to begin. And if you think about what that implies for how we understand the world, it's a very complicated research problem, which is why humanist research is hard. At the same time, what I want to add is that this research problem overlaps a great deal with ordinary life. So science, I should say, science also overlaps a great deal with ordinary life. Every time you throw a ball to someone and they catch the ball, there's some complex calculations. They're not as complex as they're not, as detailed. And every time you pour your morning coffee into your cup, there is some calculations that are going on about the flow of liquids and so on. But most people don't need to know mathematically, at the level of mathematical detail required, what exactly is happening with that liquid, what's happening with the turbulence in the cup, and so on and so forth, right? Because again, do we know that there's turbulence in liquids? Yes, because otherwise when you put your milk in your coffee, you wouldn't have to stir, okay? And you couldn't make those fancy shapes in your cappuccino with the milk, right? So we know these things, but we don't need to know them to live. We also know many things that are humanist things. That is, we understand that if someone has behaved a certain way many times, they're likely to continue to behave that way, right? It's not, it's rare that people who are jerks to us will suddenly become kind. People who are rude rarely suddenly become polite, or people who are rude to the people below them and polite to the people above them rarely change. We understand, we're all making judgments that are essentially humanist judgments that are about how does this past historical experience of either this individual or this group. We've all known people who are very nice to us when they're one-on-one with us, but then when they get in a group of their friends, they're not nice to us. That is, everyone understands, everyone who's been alive understands the difference between group dynamics and interpersonal dynamics. So these are things that humanist scholars also need to understand and do. But we do it at a level of complexity that is equivalent in some respects to the difference between you calculating how to pour your liquid into your coffee cup and the scientist who can describe exactly the flow of molecules using complex mathematics and physics models that I don't understand at all, right? Ideally, the relationship between what that scientist is doing with that coffee cup and what you're doing is the same as what the humanist scholar is doing with a social event or history or a sociological practice. The rates of divorce among immigrants to Australia who come from, who are immigrating from East Asia versus immigrating from Europe. That research is like what the scientist is doing relative to our ordinary everyday experience of, this person is sometimes nice and sometimes mean. This person acts this way and this way. I have a theory. They are angry at their mother because they think their mother favored their brother, and so on and so forth. All the things we ordinarily do that are, of course, exactly part of the life of being human, in the same way that catching a ball or pouring coffee is part of the life of being human.
Thank you. What you said about scientists and areas where they are a little bit limited reminded me of an article I read some time ago by Paul Cantor, I guess. It was called "The Scientist and the Poet." And he mentioned in the article, and he used the example of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of course. He mentioned that, scientists can tell you how to do things, but they can't tell you if you should do them. I guess what he meant in that sense was that there are areas where, like examples that you just brought up, that they're complex, let's say, social human beings that humanities are better equipped to deal with.
Okay, but I want to resist that. I mean, I haven't read the article, but I want to resist it on two fronts that are important to me. The first is that the title, The Scientist and the Poet, creates a kind of classic division between someone who is in the business of knowing and someone who is in the business of feeling or making you feel, right? I don't disagree that there are differences between scientists and poets, but I actually think that that the poet is doing something quite different from what the humanist researcher is doing. So I think it's very common to see, oh, there's science and there's poetry, and you have to be able to see, there's, like, if someone says the poetry of the stars or the poetry of mathematics, that's appealing because, of course, they seem very different. Normally you don't think of them as, and so poetry ends up standing in for a kind of, sometimes almost a kind of flowery kind of set of things. My claim would be that the poet is doing one thing, that's fine, it's good, and I love poetry, but that humanist research is actually making knowledge, because the scientist makes knowledge, the poet makes feelings or forms of expression, right? The humanist researcher makes knowledge. So in that sense, the scientific researcher and the humanist researcher have much more in common. That's why the book is called Humanist Reason, not Humanist Beauty or something like that. The other objection I want to make is to what you described in the content of Cantor's article, where he says the scientist can tell you what to do, but not whether you should do it or not. This is another classic opposition between humanist scientific knowledge and ethics, right? But I will say this, that first of all, deciding whether you should do something or not is a really complicated proposition. There are, as we know, major religious and philosophical bodies of thought devoted to it, that nonetheless, no one has lived a life in which they have always felt absolutely sure that they are doing the right thing, right? So I'm not sure, this is what I'll say, I'm not sure that ethical knowledge is knowledge of the same type as humanist knowledge or scientific knowledge. I think there, if you say to me, why did the French Revolution happen? Or why did the Iranian Revolution happen? Right? I can come up with, people have written whole books, many of them, many books. These are questions that are subject to forms of research. You look, how do societies work? What are the forces that change and shape societies? Where does the revolution come from? What is the system of government that precedes the revolution? Where are the key decision points and so on and so forth that drive or change these human factors that create what we call a revolution, obviously only in retrospect, because of course a revolution only is a revolution if it succeeds. If a revolution fails, it's called a rebellion. Right? So we don't know that the revolution is none of the people in the revolution know that they're in a revolution until after the revolution is over. And really maybe not even until maybe 20, 30 years afterwards, when it becomes clear in retrospect that the revolution succeeded. You can't say a week after it's over, yes, we had a revolution, because a week after it's over, it's still a little shaky. Maybe you have to last a couple of years, right? So these are the kinds of questions. Should the revolution have happened? Did so-and-so do a good thing? That's not for me a question of humanist expertise. I'm good at explaining how things happened and how, on the basis of the things that I understand happened, I'm good at explaining what might happen in the future. I'm good at understanding how complex social practices and behaviors and events interact with one another to create our lives, both at the big level, which is to say a revolution, but maybe sometimes also at the small level in terms of how to create a household that feels happy and healthy, or how to create a workplace that feels happy and healthy. Those are the questions. And so again, none of that for me has anything to do with ethics. So in some respects, we might think of there being four things. There's something like scientific knowledge, humanist knowledge, ethics, which I think is a different thing, and poetry or art, which is yet another thing. And of course, none of these things are completely separate, but I do think they're distinct in useful ways. And I think that the tendency to oppose science to ethics or poetry, once again, minimizes the importance of or legitimacy of something like humanist reason as we're talking about it.
A good point raised, yeah. That article was actually a very simple article. It was trying to kind of bring together because there was this dichotomy between science and, let's say, the artist as the public intellectual in the 19th century Victorians, and he was trying to give an example of an accomplished poet who was also an accomplished scientist, like Goethe, for example. And I think it was written in 85, where when these ideas were not as much prominent as or
Right.
relevant as they are today. Yeah. But thank you. You raised some very good points about ethics and ethics, arts, humanist reason being separate, but at the same time, there's some overlap between them. Um, the you also mentioned that when it comes to defending the, I wanted to ask you about the humanist reason, what the humanist reason is, but you kind of covered that in your response. And you also come up with 9 principles in your book, which you call articles. I'm not sure if you have time to go through them because there are a couple of important questions I do love to ask you. One of them is the recent attempts in humanities to step away from, let's say, I come from a literary background, so I'm thinking of post-critique or attempts to get away from all that post-structuralist
Mhm.
kind of reading texts. And there have been recent attempts to scientize literature or look at literature through something that comes as close as possible to a scientific method. And I'm thinking of Franco Moretti's mathematical approach to study a large corpus of literature, or I was at Auckland University, so I knew Professor Brian Boyd, and I know he's a very ferocious enemy of theory, and he has the idea, and he's one of the few people who has done literary Darwinism, where he comes up with the ideas of universals. And they do think of their method as being scientific method and close to, and the knowledge that they produce is knowledge proper. So do you think we can ever scientize literature or humanities in general?
I mean, my claim would be that only this. I am actually good friends with. I mean, Moretti is a friend, but also I'm good friends with a number of other prominent, people who do computational analysis of literature, including Richard Gene So, who just had a really important book come out, Ted Underwood, Andrew Piper, Laura McGrath, and so on. So I'm interested very consistently in the work that these folks are doing. I am really uninterested in either the kind of puffed up claims that some people, though not my good friends who are smarter than this, but that some people make on behalf of these scientific approaches, which is that they're real knowledge and then the other humanist stuff is just nonsense and Leninism, right? So because of course that reproduces, it seems to me, in the name of a better humanities, exactly the opposition that we started from. I'm also very, very suspicious of and disinterested in the defenses of the humanities that are that claim that this scientific takeover is bad because science is bad. That is one of the arguments that I make in the book, is that the humanities themselves are historically and reputationally trapped by an antagonism to science, which I understand to result from the difficult position of the humanities in the university in a world in which most people believe that scientific knowledge is real knowledge and humanistic knowledge is not real knowledge. But I think that position has trapped humanists in a much too defensive, antagonistic, and foolish, both incorrect and foolish. That's what I say in the book, right? That is, it's a false picture of the humanities, and it's also a foolish picture of the humanities in the sense that it's not likely to have the good effects on the humanities. So, you can say to someone, like, you could have a false belief that wasn't foolish, because in fact, you could believe, for instance, that you were really good at, let's say, what's a good false belief that wouldn't be foolish? Let's say you thought of yourself as someone who's a really good friend, and you're not a great friend, but in general, thinking of yourself as a good friend makes you a better friend than you would be. Your belief would be false, but it's not foolish in the sense that it actually helps you to think of yourself that way, and it's moving things forward, and it helps other people. So great, nice, right? But the belief the humanities have is that science is the enemy, and that certain kinds of scientific knowledge are the enemy. Now, it's true that there's kinds of scientific knowledge that are stupid, just as there are kinds of scientific knowledge that are humanistic knowledge that are stupid. And it's true that there are kinds of scientific knowledge that are damaging, epistemologically suspect, very likely to be used to disempower or hurt people or control them, just as there are forms of humanistic knowledge and thought that do those things. So My claim would be that the entire panic, one of the things I'm hoping this book does, although I don't think it will, is to convince people who are on, in some sense, my side of the humanities, to really rethink their opposition or their antagonism to some of the computational work that's happening, as well as their opposition to a whole series of other approaches, large-scale structuralist approaches that I think humanists are too suspicious of. So my claim would be, that anything that helps you know is fine. I'm really an agnostic when it comes to tools. I don't think there are good and bad tools. I think there are projects that use tools well or not well. You can build a house with a hammer. You can also, break a house with a hammer. So I'm not afraid of specific tools, and I think humanists are foolishly afraid of them. So I embrace this, but I know also that it's frustrating for people on the non-computational side to watch deans and university presidents and, in the United States, especially donors, throw money at these scientific approaches as though finally, after 3,000 years of humanist sort of knowledge production, we've finally now gotten rid of all of the nonsense that characterized humanist knowledge, and now really it's going to be scientific. I think those people are basically like The Economist, who I talked about at the beginning of our interview. And so, it's, to watch that happen is very frustrating and annoying. To watch people enthusiastically embrace this and say, oh, this is the new humanities, all this other theory was not, bullshit or political or Leninist or whatever, is a little much for me. And so I'm trying to give people a way to think past that opposition and that structure, though, I don't have too much hope that it will change lots of minds, but it might change a few minds.
Yeah, with Franco Moretti, a friend of mine introduced his works to me, and when I read the article about Hamlet, I was actually amazed because, like, mathematics is not my field, and I don't know much about it, but to me, it was a new interpretation of Hamlet and the way he had diagrammed the interaction of people in the play, and I actually welcomed it. Yeah, thank you very much. I know that we don't have much time, and I wanted to ask you, because you do raise the issue that it's those people in humanities are also to blame, and you've just mentioned why. So I skip over that question. And there's a question that I should have asked at the beginning, but I guess it's not too late to ask now. This dichotomy between scientific method or humanist method, I guess it started in the 19th century in German universities, as you've mentioned in the book. So just for the benefit of the audience, I was wondering if you could give us a brief, maybe a 2 or 3 minute, let's say, snapshot of what happened at that time and why we have this big dichotomy now.
So the thing to understand is that, the modern university, which is only really 1,000 years old, is basically a humanist, that is philosophical and theological university until the mid 1800s, right? That is, there are essentially no real other fields of knowledge. And the beginning of the rise of the field called natural philosophy, starting in the 1600s, which eventually becomes science, right? So natural philosophy is the original name for science and eventually becomes science. And as science then becomes integrated into the university, what happens in those first couple hundred years is that there's a division of labor that's established, where science is for, again, gravity, whatever, apples falling out of trees, steam engines and whatnot. And everything else is the study of human being, human life, philosophy, so on and so on. In the mid-19th century, there is the rise or the development of two related fields. The field of statistics, which, as I point out in the book, starts as the study of, it's the scientific use of data or information or numbers for the management of the state. The original meaning of statistics is Statistik. Staat is the German word for state. So it's the study of, or the manipulation of numbers and information for the state, which is why, and this is the beginning of sociology in some sense, right? Or political science that's oriented towards I mean, if you think about Plato or someone who sort of says, what is the good society? That's political science at some level, but political science that's oriented towards quantitative data management. So in the middle of the 19th century, and then from that period forward through the end of the 19th century, you get the development of all the modern social sciences. Economics, I mean, again, economics has an earlier theoretical beginning, but it now begins to be integrated in the university, but especially sociology, the modern version of political science are taking place there. And at the same time, you get the beginnings of neurological science. So the combination of all of these things, it constitutes for everyone who is in the humanities at the time a huge loss of prestige or potential loss of prestige. Because now, what are the humanities supposed to do? Before the humanities explain everything, then all of a sudden the humanities, or what we call, I mean, they weren't called the humanities, but you have a group of people who explained everything. They're the philosophers. You know, if you ask a philosopher, you go back 2,000 years, you ask a philosopher would explain what we call chemistry, anthropology, philosophy, biology, political science. Like if you read Aristotle or Plato, you know, they're trying to describe everything, right? So you have that field now shrunk down because you're not doing the natural world anymore. Then all of a sudden, now you're not doing, now you've lost society. Okay, and then with the beginning of neuroscience and specifically with statistical psychology, now you're losing individual people. So now what's left? All you have left is like history, right? Maybe literature, but again, the study of literature proper doesn't even exist in the mid-19th century or even at the end of the 19th century, it's just getting going. So this is a tremendously scary situation for a group of people who both scary intellectually, scary institutionally. You know, you used to be the dean of a big department, now you're the dean of a small department, so on and so forth. You used to have lots of jobs, your students were getting jobs, now your students don't know what to do, right? So that institutional crisis in which a kind of the humanities have to not only defend themselves, but also, you know, are being asked real questions. Do you guys know anything? What are you guys doing? If we know this, and again, remember, this is also the period where you begin to get positivist / scientific theories of history, which is to say theories of history that say, if we can find the laws of history, the mathematical laws of history modeled on the laws of gravity or the laws of planetary motion, if we can find these, then why would you need, again, why would you need a historian? All you have to do once you know the laws of history is just, you know, in the same way that once you know the Pythagorean theorem, you can make lots of triangles. You can just make history and so on. So laws of history, laws of sociology, laws of individual behavior, and so on. So for this is also the beginning of theories of social Darwinism, right? Which is, and again, social Darwinism is one of the major intellectual origins of evolutionary psychology, which is the attempt to apply essentially biological science up at large scales to the process of human history and human social life by showing how all of human history and social life is the result of evolutionary processes, right, that work in a certain way. So that's the situation of the humanities in the late 19th century. And it is a situation of tremendous crisis and fear and anxiety and also of opportunity because what happens in that period in the German university, and the reason the German university is important is because the German university model is the model. Remember that, you know, by the end of the 19th century, not that many countries have universities, right? Some countries have old universities. So Italy, France, England, a few others, Holland. But the German university system is the university system that gets exported worldwide. The first place that it really gets significantly exported is the United States. So the model of the German university that gets created in this period is the model that then ends up being adopted largely in the United States after that period. And again, most American universities are founded after 1855 or so, some before that, Harvard, Yale, and so on and so forth. But essentially most American universities, and then because of course of the power and prestige of America, the American system then gets exported to the rest of the world. So, oh, I think we just froze.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Your image just froze. Okay, well, anyway, so you're back. Good. So basically, that's why this model is so important. That's what happens in Germany is so important because it's not just relevant for Germany; it's relevant for everyone who's in a university today, practically. Anyway, and that's, you know, I can go on, but you asked for 2 to 3 minutes, and I've already gone over that. But essentially, that's the situation: is what are the humanities? How do they know? What is the legitimacy of their knowledge, and how are they different from the sciences? And my argument in the book is that this is the place where some huge mistakes get made, completely understandable mistakes, but huge mistakes intellectually. Again, mistakes that are both factual mistakes that they're incorrect as descriptions of the humanities, but also foolish in the sense that they actually end up limiting the scope of the humanities and the legitimacy of the humanities, even as they're trying to defend it. And those mistakes, I think, are basically living with us. That's where we are today, very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. What you just mentioned about German universities reminded me of a book I recently read. It was called The Battle for Classics, but I'm not sure about the author. We talked about this model of German universities in the United States at the end of, towards the end of 19th century. And when there was this debate whether we need to study Latin or Greek works, and we have to study something that gives us a job, more professionalization of universities.
Right.
Thank you very much for your time, Eric. And I do like to mention that this book is a wonderful book. It has lots and lots of food for thought. And what we just discussed is only, we just scratched the surface. There are lots of great things in the book, especially those 9 articles of principles of humanities that you bring up. So I do strongly recommend to our viewers to read the book. Thank you very much, Eric, for your time. It was wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You're welcome. All right. You too. Take care, Morteza. Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye.